You knew these cars before you ever sat in one. If there was a cinema anywhere in your childhood, the shapes were already familiar. The long hood of a Mustang, the chrome along the flank of an Impala, a Cadillac that filled most of the frame and then asked for more. For the better part of a century, the companies that built those machines owned almost 9 out of every 10 cars sold in their own country, and the men who ran them never once seriously entertained the idea that the arithmetic could turn. They had every reason not to. Then comes the spring of 2009. General Motors walks into a courtroom and files for bankruptcy, the 4th largest the United States had ever seen. Chrysler has already done the same a month before.
It appears Chrysler, the country's 3rd largest automaker, will file for bankruptcy, becoming the first of the big 3 automakers to do so.
The checks keeping both of them alive are being signed in Washington. And here is the part that tends to get left out. The collapse was not something the market sprang on Detroit in 2008. It had been written into the public record 3.5 decades earlier by one engineer, using a Detroit car as the proof. The car was a Chevrolet Impala. The man who paid for it was 66 years old. And 3 named executives in Detroit were holding the evidence in their hands when they chose to look the other way. This is the story of how one small Japanese hatchback ended the largest car industry on Earth. Go back to 1966. Between them, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler held just under 90% of the American car market. General Motors alone was bigger than the economies of most countries. Every model year, the cars stretched a little longer, sat a little lower, weighed a little more, because that was what selling looked like, and nobody had a reason to question it. Petrol cost around 32 cents a gallon. There were more than 90 million vehicles registered across the country. The view from every boardroom in the city ran along the same line. People wanted size. People wanted power. Anything else was a problem for somebody who was not them. But out in the country, those cars were leaving a mark. Los Angeles sat under a brown lid most afternoons, thick enough that on the worst days, schools kept the children indoors. In Pittsburgh, in Gary, in Houston, the air was measuring badly enough to send people to hospital wards. Pressure was gathering in legislatures, and it was the kind of pressure Detroit had no intention of welcoming. 5,500 miles away, in 1965, there was a company most Americans had never heard of. Honda was, by any global measure, barely a car maker at all. It was the biggest motorcycle manufacturer in the world, and it had only just begun building cars, a little truck and a small sports car put on sale 2 years before, almost as a hobby beside the real business. The Japanese Trade Ministry had told Honda directly to stay out of automobiles. Cars were the territory of Toyota and Nissan, and that was settled policy. Honda paid no attention. In the same year, it set up a small unit it called the Air Pollution Research Lab. Nobody in Detroit had any reason to know it existed. The man behind all of it had been born in 1906 in a rural prefecture, taught himself everything he knew, and started as a teenager sweeping floors at a repair shop in Tokyo before opening one of his own. From there, he went racing. At a speed event in 1936, he set a Japanese record, then crashed at the same speed and nearly lost the sight in one eye. He opened his Technical Research Institute in 1946 by bolting surplus wartime engines onto bicycles. Within 13 years, he ran the largest motorcycle company on the planet, and then he turned to cars, against the government, against his own partners, against every informed person in his industry. His method was already famous inside the company. He would stand up in public and announce that Honda was about to do something, and only then turn to his engineers and let them know they had better make it real. One of those engineers later said that working for the man felt like being sent up a ladder and then watching him carry the ladder away. When the pollution lab was founded, one of its own founders admitted years afterward that the team did not, at the start, know what nitrogen oxides actually were. They had to be taught. The country did not even own the right equipment to measure the things properly. The whole effort began in something close to ignorance, and that, looking back, may have been the one advantage they had. There were no comfortable old assumptions in the way. because there were no old assumptions at all. Then the law landed. A senator named Edmund Muskie wrote the Clean Air Act of 1970, and he wrote it deliberately to demand more than the existing machinery could deliver. A 90% cut in carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons by the 1975 model year. A 90% cut in nitrogen oxides the year after. The point was not to reward what was already being made. The point was to force the industry to invent something it did not yet have. Detroit's reply was unanimous, and it started before the ink was even dry on the bill. In testimony to Congress in 1970, a Ford executive vice president named Lee Iacocca told lawmakers plainly that the technology, as anyone understood it then, would make it impossible to keep building cars past the start of 1975. A vice president at Chrysler told a Senate committee the same thing in different words, that the industry simply did not possess the means to cut emissions by that margin. When regulators held hearings in 1972 and again in the spring of 1973, all three of the big makers repeated it. It cannot be done. Not by us. Not on this clock. And I want to be fair here, because the first time I went through the record, I assumed Detroit was simply lying outright, and the truth is more interesting than that. The conventional fix everyone was reaching for was the catalytic converter. And the converter, as it existed in 1972, had genuine, documented faults. It ran hot enough to set fire to dry grass at the roadside. It demanded unleaded petrol that was not yet on sale everywhere. It stole power from the engine. And it wore out. Every company on Earth was attacking the problem at the same end of the car, the tailpipe, trying to scrub the exhaust after the damage was already done. Nobody had thought to ask the question that the small Japanese lab was about to ask out loud. What if you changed the way the fuel burned in the first place? In Detroit, that question was not even on the agenda. In Japan, a team that had recently had to be told what nitrogen oxides were was about to be handed an instruction that would set it against the most powerful industrial lobby in the world. But before any of his engineers could face that, the founder had to face something himself. In 1970, the only man at Honda who could speak to him as an equal asked for a private meeting. This was the co-founder, the financial mind that had always balanced the founder's engineering instinct, the one person allowed to push back without flinching. He laid the situation out without softening it. The new engine, as the team had designed it, was going to need liquid cooling. And the founder had spent 20 years building his entire philosophy on air cooling, lighter, simpler. It was not a preference, it was an obsession, and it was his name on the door. So the co-founder asked the only question that mattered. Did he intend to remain president of the company, or did he intend to remain its engineer because he could no longer be both? The founder's answer, as the company's own history records it, was almost casual. He thought he would stay on as president. The engine got its liquid cooling. The engine got its direction. And the team was told that from that day, this engine was no longer a project. It was the plan for the company's survival. The engineer leading it understood the trap completely. A rich mixture of fuel and air lights easily and makes power, but it burns filthy. A lean mixture burns clean, but it is hard to ignite, makes less power and runs hotter, which produces more of exactly the nitrogen oxides the law was now demanding they cut. Push hard on any one of those levers and the others move against you. Every engineer in the global industry was caught in the same loop, and none of them had found the way out. Working through ideas borrowed from diesel research, the team arrived at something simple in concept. A small second chamber, a pre-chamber, set apart from the main cylinder, able to hold its own rich mixture on its own terms. Easy to describe, almost impossibly hard to make work in a petrol engine you intended to sell. What they built, in the end, had a kind of elegance to it. An ordinary cylinder, with a small extra chamber mounted above it, the two divided by a plate full of holes. The little chamber had its own intake valve and its own supply of fuel. and it carried a rich charge that would catch a spark without trouble. The big chamber underneath ran very lean. The spark plug lived up in the small chamber. When it fired, the rich mixture lit cleanly and threw a jet of flame down through the holes, and that jet spun into a vortex that swept through the lean mixture below and burned all of it. The engine ran lean overall. The paradox was not beaten by cleaning up the mess afterward. It was beaten by changing what the burning did in the first place. The first running test engine, a single cylinder of 300 cubic centimeters built off an existing small Honda, was finished in January 1970. The results on the bench were not conclusive. They were promising. For this founder, promising was permission. On the 12th of February 1971, in a hall in Tokyo packed with the assembled Japanese press, he stood up and announced that Honda was building an engine that would meet the American Clean Air Act. The patents were not filed. The team had not even settled on how it would deliver the fuel. The name he gave it from the podium was a deliberately confusing string of words, chosen specifically so that nobody listening could work out what the system actually did. Years later, one of the engineers described the feeling in the lab when that press conference ended. The founder had as good as told them that if he waited for them to say when it would be finished, they would never say it, and the company would go bankrupt before the words left their mouths. The ladder was gone again. The research building where they worked was not what Detroit would have recognized as a serious laboratory. It was modest. Half the equipment was improvised. What hit you first, at 2 a.m, was the smell, the byproduct of burned fuel and machine oil hanging in the closed air of the test cells, a sharpness that worked into your clothes and stayed there for days. The rigs ran through the night, injectors firing on a set rhythm, instruments flickering, an oscilloscope someone had tuned at midnight and simply left running. By the spring of 1972, there were around 400 engineers on it. The rule was blunt. When a prototype failed on the bench, nobody went home until the day's particular failure had been solved, and so they put bunk beds in rooms around the grounds. They built something like 100 prototype engines over the life of the work, and not one of them broke in the same way twice. Somewhere in the middle of it, the founder's language began to shift. He started calling the program the company's great opportunity, and one of the engineers took the worry to management directly, that the old man could not be allowed to talk that way, because the founder had always insisted his engineers worked for themselves and for the wider world. And now the words coming out of him sounded like a corporate strategy. The pressure was changing the man as much as the machine. By December 1972, the engine was ready to be certified, but the car meant to carry it was not finished. So the team did something improvised and slightly absurd. They fitted the new engines into the body shells of a rival Nissan, weighted the boots down with sandbags, and shipped them across the Pacific to the testing facility in Michigan. Across 1 week that month, they ran the cycle. They passed. It was the first engine anywhere in the world to meet the 1975 standards of the American Clean Air Act, and it had been built by a motorcycle company that, 2 years earlier, had needed to be taught the chemistry. On the 19th of March 1973, the regulators sat down in a government building in Washington to weigh Detroit's request for an extension. Of every manufacturer on the planet, exactly 2 had shown they could already meet the standard, and both were Japanese. All 3 American giants stood up and said they could not. The General Motors engineers told the room that the new design burned 1/4 more fuel and made 1/4 less power. Ford's people agreed. And then the chairman of General Motors himself dismissed the whole approach as having no future in a real car. It was, he suggested, the sort of thing that might suit a toy motorcycle engine. It had nothing to teach a proper American V8. What the founder did in response is the kind of thing that, the more you look at it, the more perfect it becomes. He bought a car. He paid for it himself, a 1973 Chevrolet Impala with the biggest, thirstiest V8 that General Motors put on a forecourt that year. 5.5 liters of the most American engine in existence. He had it flown to Japan. His engineers machined a new set of cylinder heads carrying their pre-chamber design, made it a custom intake, fitted it to the car's own carburetor, and left it with its full power intact. Then they flew the Impala back to Michigan, and the same regulators ran that big Chevrolet V8 through the same emissions cycle. It passed. The most powerful man in the American car industry, who had told a government hearing that the technology was fit only for toys, had just been handed back his own flagship, fixed by a foreign motorcycle firm, doing exactly what he had sworn under examination was beyond anyone's reach. And then the founder released the regulator's report and invited the entire world to read it. If you find that as remarkable as I did the first time I came across it, that one engineer bought a Chevrolet out of his own pocket and used it to break the credibility of an entire industry, then take a second to subscribe. There will be a great deal more of this on the channel. The Detroit engineers were not wrong in every detail. In certain configurations, their objections about fuel and power had some truth in them. What they were catastrophically wrong about was the belief that those details mattered more than the single thing the little engine could do that theirs could not. And the deeper trouble, the thing nobody in those boardrooms had yet grasped, was that the report from the Impala test was now a public document. Any reporter, any regulator, any ordinary buyer with a library card could read it for themselves. There is a third figure in this story, and his car is the other half of the proof. He was born in Michigan in 1909, an engineer to his bones, who joined General Motors as a student and spent 4 decades climbing through its engineering divisions until he became president of the company. In 1960, he had championed a small rear-engined car that a young lawyer named Ralph Nader would later make famous for all the wrong reasons, and he survived that. His answer to the threat coming from Japan was a new small car launched in 1971 with an aluminium engine block and a light body, which on paper was exactly the right machine. In practice, the engine could not keep its head gasket sealed, the body rusted faster than almost anything else of its time, and the whole thing turned into a monument to the distance between what Detroit said and what Detroit delivered. The contrast was almost too clean to be real. The Japanese car used an old idea, a chamber bolted onto an ordinary engine, arranged intelligently. The American car used cutting-edge metallurgy and could not stay watertight. One was a simple thing that worked. The other was a clever thing that did not. The man who built the second one was no cartoon villain. He had the money, the warning, and the authority to answer the threat properly. He answered it with that car instead, and he retired in 1974, the same year the Japanese hatchback was named Car of the Year by an American motoring magazine. Then, in October 1973, an event 10,000 miles from any of their factories settled the argument for the public the way the Impala had already settled it for the regulators. The oil producers of the Middle East cut their output, and then, 2 days later, aimed an embargo squarely at the United States. Within weeks, 9 in 10 American filling stations had voluntarily shut on Saturday nights and Sundays at the president's request. By the worst of it, the following February, as many as 1 in 5 stations had no fuel to sell at any given moment. The national speed limit dropped. The price at the pump climbed from 38.5 cents a gallon in the spring of 1973 to 55 cents by the summer of 1974, a rise of more than 40% in barely a year. People who would have laughed at a small foreign car 12 months earlier were now trading their enormous sedans for one while they sat in the queue. The American small car that failed was on the dealership floor. So was the Japanese one that did not. That December, the new car went on sale in Japan. Across the country, industrial output was falling as the oil shock bit, and Honda's sales did the opposite. Production rose to chase the demand and could not catch it. The market had made up its mind. A year later, the car arrived in the United States as a 1975 model. It weighed a little over 1,800 pounds. It made 53 horsepower. It cost a few $100s more than the version without the clever engine, and it ran on leaded fuel, low-lead fuel, or unleaded fuel without harming itself, which in a country halfway through a chaotic switch to unleaded turned the daily hunt for petrol from a problem into a non-event. The advertising said it in 3 words: any kind of gas. The car sat in the forecourt with a quality that did not fit the American script around it. The dashboard was tighter, more upright. The wheel was smaller. There was a quietness at idle that nobody in Detroit had bothered to engineer. And it started every single morning, which the failed American car had taught a whole generation of buyers not to take for granted. Under the bonnet, that strange little extra chamber sat bolted on top of the engine. An ugly small lump that looked like the answer to nothing. It was the answer to everything. So now the public record was the weapon. 3 executives, 1 hearing, in the spring of 1973. The chairman of the biggest of them all, on the record, calling the technology a toy. The Impala report, sitting in the open for anyone to pull. And the car itself, parked on the forecourt between the 2 American small cars that did not work, wearing a price sticker, proving in metal every claim Detroit had testified was impossible. That hatchback held the highest fuel economy rating of any car the regulators tested 4 years running. It was named Car of the Year in Japan 3 years in a row. It took a podium place in the European voting and a top award in America. The first generation alone sold around 1.25 million. A small Japanese economy car had become, by every measure anyone could agree on, the most desirable thing on wheels in the country that invented the muscle car. It was not flawless. Those early cars rusted badly in the Salt Belt states, badly enough that the company eventually signed a federal agreement to replace fenders on hundreds of thousands of them, but the flaws were on the wrong side of the comparison. And here is the part that ought to have stopped Detroit cold. Once the report was public, the licenses started coming. Toyota signed first, then Ford, then Chrysler. One after another, the giants of the industry quietly took out agreements to build the technology their own spokesman had spent 2 years calling impossible in front of Congress. General Motors did something stranger than any of them. It did not ask to license the design at all. Having stood in a hearing room and written the thing off as a toy, it came back wanting simply to buy the finished engines from Honda by the 100,000, as though the firm in Japan were a parts supplier it could place an order with. And Honda, a company that could barely build enough engines for its own cars, did not have the capacity to feed General Motors, and said so. The largest car maker on earth had talked itself out of the one thing that might have saved it, and then asked for it back in the only form it could not be given. In June 1974, the president signed a law that pushed the emission standards back by 2 model years.
The great question of the 70s is, shall we surrender to our surroundings, or shall we make our peace with nature and begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, to our land, and to our water?
Detroit had lobbied for the delay, and Detroit got it. The extension was real. The credibility was gone for good. No act of Congress could change the fact that the car already existed, or that one of these companies had publicly embarrassed itself with a Chevrolet the year before. The founder, his point made, stepped down from the presidency that same autumn. His co-founder retired on the very same day. He took an honorary title, and then, by his own settled conduct, gave his successors no advice at all, and put no member of his family into the running of the firm. He had built one of the great industrial enterprises of the century and walked away from steering it. What followed in Detroit was not recovery. It was a long misreading. By the start of the 1980s, the only thing protecting the American makers from the small, efficient cars they still could not build well was a set of voluntary limits on Japanese imports, and the Japanese answer to that was to simply build the cars inside America. Plants went up in Ohio, in Tennessee, in Kentucky, run under Japanese management, paying American wages, and turning out vehicles that scored measurably better on quality than anything leaving the old American lines. The breathing room those import limits bought was used badly. A new chairman arrived at General Motors who had come up through the accounts, not the engineering floor, and whose reading of the crisis was that the cars were not the problem at all. The problem, as he saw it, was labor cost and inefficiency, and the answer was technology and acquisition. He spent $2.5 billion buying a data company. He spent over $5 billion on an aerospace firm. He poured money into a vast automation drive that became famous for robots spray painting one another instead of the cars, and for welding doors shut on the day a plant opened. He was trying to buy his company a new identity, and what he produced was a company that understood itself less at the end of the decade than at the start. The full bill for the reinvention ran past $90 billion, more than the entire market value of Toyota at the time, and at the end of all of it, the productivity of a General Motors plant still sat below that of the Japanese factories down the road. A documentary maker built a film around the man, and the reason it lands is not that he was uniquely wicked. It is that he was perfectly typical. A man who understood balance sheets and deals and did not understand cars, running a company that needed the exact opposite. By 1980, the Japanese brands held around a fifth of the American market, and Detroit's combined share had fallen below 70% for the first time since the war. When an independent quality survey started publishing its numbers later in the decade, the gap was there for everyone to see, year after year, wide and steady. And then, for a while, Detroit was handed a reprieve it had done nothing to deserve. In the 1990s, the sport utility vehicle arrived. Petrol was cheap again. These big trucks were classed, for emissions purposes, as light trucks, which exempted them from the very standards that had cost Detroit its name 20 years earlier. The American makers made record profits on them and told themselves they had come back. What they had actually done was take the lesson of 1973 and postpone it by a decade and a half. The bill was still sitting on the table. It had not been paid. It had only been pushed down the road. Because underneath all of it was something no balance sheet and no SUV could fix. After 1975, every American who read a newspaper knew that the three largest corporations in their country had sent senior men to public hearings, put claims on the record, and sworn as fact something that turned out to be plainly untrue. They knew one of those companies had been handed back its own big sedan, rebuilt by a motorcycle firm, doing what it had said could not be done. The question facing Detroit after 1975 was no longer whether it could build a clean, efficient car. The car on the forecourt had answered that. The real question was simpler and far worse. When Detroit said something could not be done, was there any reason left to believe it? For a whole generation of buyers, the answer was no. That is not a market problem, and it is not a manufacturing problem. It is a problem of trust, and trust broken on that scale does not come back on the schedule of a model year. If a story like this stays with you, the way it has stayed with me, and the way I suspect it will for anyone who grew up around cars on either side of the Atlantic, then this is the moment to subscribe. There is a great deal more of it here. In 2008, the financial crisis arrived hand in hand with a spike in fuel prices, and American buyers reached suddenly and urgently for small, efficient cars. Detroit did not have them. The decade of profit on big trucks had gone into marketing and bonuses, not into the part of the catalog that suddenly mattered. On the 30th of April 2009, Chrysler filed for bankruptcy. On the 1st of June, General Motors filed too, with assets of just over $82 billion, the fourth largest bankruptcy in the country's history at the time. Its chief executive had already been pushed out at the request of the new administration. The federal government committed around $80 billion to keeping the two companies alive, roughly a fifth of the entire bailout fund. Look at the symmetry of it. In 1973, Detroit had gone to the government and asked it to soften the standards it could not meet. In 2009, Detroit went to the government and asked it to fund the survival of the company that had never met them. 2 moments, 36 years apart. The same actor on the stage, the same request. Save us from the consequences of the thing we chose not to build. Stand outside the old plant in Flint, Michigan now. The press lines are silent. The car park holds nothing. The neighborhood that once lived on the wages from inside those gates is mostly gone. The great pneumatic press that stamped out a panel every 43 seconds in 1965 has not moved in years. Close your eyes for a moment. Go back. Hear that press cycling, steady as a pulse. Smell the cutting oil and the fresh lacquer drifting off the paint line. Feel the weight of a Cadillac fender as it comes off the die. Watch the men walk out at the end of a shift. Men who could afford the cars they built into a town that paid enough for a house and a pension and a meal out on a Friday. One of them, the record will tell you, drove home one evening in 1965 in a brand new Cadillac his foreman had personally vouched for on credit against a stamping job he had held for 19 years. Now open your eyes. The presses are quiet. The car park is empty. We did not lose this story to a shortage of resources. A team that had to be taught what nitrogen oxides were in 1965 had it solved by 1973. Detroit had the same 8 years, and more engineers, more money, more factories than the lab in Japan could have dreamed of. The difference was a man in Tokyo who announced the answer before his own people had found it, and then bought a Chevrolet Impala with his own money to prove the chairman of General Motors had told a government hearing something that was not true. We lost it to a question Detroit never once asked itself with any seriousness. What if we are wrong? It was put to them, in a hearing room, in the spring of 1973, and the wrong men answered it. The Impala answered it for them 8 months later. The bill arrived in the summer of 2009.